I'd like to talk today about a little bit of software development techniques and challenges that have existed ever since the 1970s when software development first became a discipline. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is define a couple words. First, a methodology is a system of methods in a particular area of study or activity. So Agile would be a methodology. Scrum would be an Agile method. In other words, Agile meaning the methodology, where the method itself would be Scrum. So Scrum is a particular procedure for accomplishing the process of doing an Agile software development. The history of software development is a problem of cost overruns, delayed releases, and features that are less than expected. In other words, a lot of times you'll get to a point in a project where it's already overcost based on all the documentation that you did at the very beginning, the schedule that you wrote at the very beginning, and the estimate of cost that you wrote at the very beginning before knowing all the things that you were going to stumble over as things went on. So in 1956, we've got the first software development method coming out called Stage-Wise, and it was basically a waterfall process. You documented everything, then you designed it, then you wrote the code, then you tried to deploy it. Classical waterfall, like Winston Royce seemed to postulate in his 1970 paper, came out, of course, in 1970. We continue to move forward, and the first real iterative sort of Agile method we come to is Spiral, that came along in 1980. Now, Spiral gets its name from writing a spiral type of notation, in the respect that it would start with design and then go through the regular waterfall method, but it would do it with a small portion of the project. Then it would also start the next piece of it, and they would start off, but the first piece would already be in the design phase or later phases. But they would be focusing on small enough pieces that they would in fact be able to work through those pieces easier. So the idea of Spiral was to break it up into several different pieces of the project and work on those separately. Now, I worked on a project that used the Spiral method back in the 90s, and basically it was a modified waterfall. They took a small piece, ran it through waterfall. They took another piece and ran it through the waterfall. And, it was only as effective as waterfall ever is. It always ran cost overruns. Things would go from one spiral push to the next because they couldn't accomplish it in the time frame. And the cost overruns, of course, were still the same. So while Spiral had a good idea trying to get this iterative sort of pattern going, it really didn't do anything to advance the world of Agile, okay? So Objectory started coming out. That was just more focused on object-oriented programming. So it really didn't advance things. The first real advance we have is when Scrum started being experimented with, and rapid application, or RAD, in 1990. Scrum and RAD were basically an idea that we'll build the software first and let you see it. In other words, rapid application development was high on prototyping. They built a quick prototype and let you see what was happening, and then they elicited a response from the customer that would allow that customer to give feedback early and give feedback often as you continued to build the software. The criticism of RAD was that you ended up with software that was thrown over the fence but had very little documentation. So management hated the idea of RAD simply because there was never documentation to maintain it after the programmers left and the project was done. So RAD was given a black eye simply because there wasn't a focus on documentation. So you continue on with adaptive software development, which was the same people that developed RAD were developing adaptive software development. And because of that, it had kind of the same problems, but it was a little bit more advanced. extreme programming came on in about 1995. And so you see the rational unified process in 1998, pragmatic programming in 2000. But then you have something really radical happening. We've got extreme programming being played around with. We've got Scrum being advanced in the 1990 to 1995 range. But then you have people getting together in Utah and trying to hammer out really the direction that software development should take. And they come out with the Agile Manifesto. Now, the Agile Manifesto was really a huge advance in software development because it recognized that we're not building a bridge, we're not building a building, we're not hiring union laborers that did a certain amount of electrical in a certain period of time, or plumbers that did a certain amount of plumbing in a certain period of time. We were hiring creative people who had varying talents and varying abilities, creating a creative project. For example, you probably would never have tried to hold Michelangelo to a particular budget or a particular time frame when creating the painting of the Sistine Chapel. The thought is just ridiculous. So why do we try to restrict or put on a schedule people who create software? Let's move on and look at what the Agile Manifesto came up with. First off, they believe that individuals are more and interactions are more important than processes and tools. In other words, we're going to be more concerned with the individuals who want the software and conversing with them than we are over a certain process, waterfall process, or certain tools that have to have certain documentation and such. We prefer working software over gobs of documentation and no working software. We prefer to collaborate with the customers over negotiating a contract at the beginning with a certain price tag and a certain schedule and a certain set of features. And of course, the first thing you do is throw that over the fence to the customer. They're saying, I don't want to pay that much. You got to cut the price in half. Well, what features do you want to cut? None. I don't want to cut any features out. So it becomes this big contract negotiation. Well, what you need to do is you need to let the creative people be creative, and they'll generally come up with it faster and better than what you could have gotten if you had this huge contract or schedule or cost negotiated up front. Then responding to change rather than following a plan, meaning we're going to respond to corrections in our understanding all along the way versus following the plan that we negotiated in this main contract up front, where the schedule was all laid out and the features were all laid out, and the way that we were going to do it was all laid out at the very beginning. We're going to let discovery dominate rather than following this plan when we hadn't yet discovered the challenges with that plan. So what they tried to say is they valued everything on the right, but they valued the large type on the left more than what was on the right. Now, these were the people who signed the Agile Manifesto. And what you'll see is that a lot of these people came from various disciplines. So Crystal was created by Alistair Coburn. Then you go on to extreme programming created by Ken Beck. Now remember, Ken Beck created extreme programming kind of before the Agile Manifesto, so he was already playing with an Agile type of development process before the Agile Manifesto came out. Then you had a couple other people who were playing with extreme programming with him, Ward Cunningham and Ron Jeffries. Scrum, we had 3 people involved with Scrum from 1995 to 2000, Beadle, Ken Schwaber, and Jeff Sutherland. Then you had Jim Highsmith working with RAD and the adaptive software development that we talked about. So the Agile methodology, if we take all of the methods that are comprised in that methodology, They consist of a series of tiny projects. It aims for high customer satisfaction through early and continuous delivery of useful pieces of software, so that they can go through an iterative process of both delivery and communication with the user to continue providing more and more feedback. Like Lean, they don't want to do anything more than they need to do at any particular time before it needs to be done. So they'll wait and document more later than earlier. They'll document requirements and desires, user stories, for example, before they start developing, but they won't develop full documentation until toward the end of the project. So you've got to be able to empower your employees. You've got to build robust communication and not manage by documentation and negotiation along the way. You've got to build healthy teams of project managers who are willing to work with the customers so that they can give that feedback back and forth. And if you do all those things, you can actually implement an agile software method. So if you like what you heard here, please hit that like button, and look forward to seeing you again. Thanks.